Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Steve. Welcome to All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo.
There's so much to love about this amazing show, and we're happy to connect to fans like us who discover new things with each rewatch.
Be advised, while we aren't gratuitous with spoilers, they can pop up as we discuss character arcs through the final season. Let's get started with Mad Men C to Z.
Welcome to Season 4, Episode 8, The Summer Man. This episode was written by Lisa Albert, Janet Leahy, and Matthew Weiner, and directed by Phil Abraham. Matt Weiner has said this is his favorite episode from Season 4, which is a little surprising to me given how much praise The Suitcase earned, or even the upcoming episodes The Beautiful Girls or Tomorrowland. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of voiceover narration. It seems a little intrusive and not as subtle. But this is the only episode that uses that device, so I can forgive it. How did the narration work for you in this episode?
I'm the same. It just feels a little heavy-handed to me, sort of, hey, viewer, this is what you're supposed to think or understand from this. I have so much respect for the writers of this show that I'm going to assume that with their voiceover, it's not as simplistic or overbearing as it can be in a lot of other occasions where it's used. I find myself, as I listen to Don, trying to assess whether I feel he's being truthful and honest and open about what he thinks or feels versus influence to document something that may or may not be the whole truth, at least as he sees it.
Oh, me too. I think that's a huge part of my frustration with it because I'm excited to finally get to hear exactly what he thinks unfiltered, and it's still guarded, and that's disappointing.
And the larger theme of this episode really is Don trying to get back control of his life. And we've seen how his alcoholism has gotten to a bad place. He's not in a relationship, still a lot of friction with Betty on the family side of things. And then even here as he's swimming in the pool, he starts coughing after he swims a lap. And we can see that physically he's not in a great place.
Yes, the episode opens with Don at the New York Athletic Club, and he's swimming, and we have some narrated voiceover. Back in episode 3, when Don was leaving Anna to go to Acapulco, she told him, "You should swim as much as you can there. It clears your head." So, of course, now that Anna's gone, he's missing her and leaning on her counsel even after she's gone. We saw Don go into the ocean like a baptism earlier before he decided to start over with Betty again. But the pool life is like a new start, I guess. And when I watch Don exercising and swimming, even though he's coughing at first, I feel hopeful for him. It does feel like a fresh start to immerse himself in this instead of the bottles.
Yes, I get that same sense of potential renewal or taking another shot at it. In his commentary, Matt Weiner mentions, Don is getting older. So things like being an alcoholic and having high blood pressure, as you age, these abuses to your body start to take a greater and greater toll. So it makes sense that he would come around and revisit that and potentially try and address it.
I want to mention there's a short story by John Cheever called The Swimmer, and it's about a man who decides to take all the suburban swimming pools on the way back to his house. That's how he's going to travel. And he sees himself as young and successful, but as he interacts with each neighbor on the way, he comes to understand a different truth about himself. And I don't want to give away all the things, but it's an interesting look. It has strong parallels to Don Draper's journey. As the scene continues, we switch back to Don's apartment and he's journaling. And the most interesting I get from this particular voiceover is Don saying he never wrote more than 250 words. He's a writer, and we have this image of him that no matter what he is a genius creative writer ad man. But even that piece of the monument that's Don Draper is eroding a little here. Like Peggy, he doesn't have some novel in a drawer or a manifesto he's writing on the side, and he doesn't even dream of doing that someday. His day job is his art.
And we also get a little confirmation, I think, of his academic history, which, we probably all assume he hasn't gone to college, but he mentions here that he laments never having finished high school. So the idea that Don Draper has managed to be this genius creative writer on Madison Avenue, lacking even a high school diploma, that's a surprise for me for this character.
Yes, and when he's talking to Stephanie, he mentions he went to some night school, and you sort of wonder, did he really do that even? Maybe that is also not the truth. You can't trust
Oh,
anything
wow,
Disney says.
you're really suspicious. I take that at face value, and I'm going to assume Don Draper did go to night school. But it is interesting as we think about him in the context of being a self-made man in this world and having to conceal his rough origins as much as possible. For him to get where he is on the basis of only night school, I think is an impressive indicator of his raw talent and ability, and then simultaneously that gnawing insecurity or concern about the pieces that he lacks, especially amongst the crowd that he runs in now.
Outside the pool, we get this very classic shot of Don Draper, except for the sitting on the couch back to camera with the arm outstretched. This is a really classic Don Draper look, I think. The New York Athletic Club was founded in 1868. And here's Don standing on the streets of New York City as we hear, "I Can't Get No Satisfaction" by the Rolling Stones. It was released as a single in June of 1965, and it was their first #1 hit in the US.
And also notably, it's about advertising. And the lyrics go on to talk about how we're being pitched these messages and told how we should be or want to be, or, how to view other people through this lens of advertising. So it really is the perfect lyrical fit for Mad Men. And it's just such an iconic moment. And it to me, it almost serves as a trailer for Mad Men, the series, this sequence where Don's out in the sunshine in 1965 with this exciting new hit from the Rolling Stones about his very industry, coolly lighting a cigarette, wearing his aviator glasses, women walking by, and just the diversity of New York City on the sidewalk. It's such a great scene, and it almost makes you feel like, in addition to the renewal that we had with Don working out and trying to reset his life, it almost feels like a mid-season reset.
I agree. We've seen this man stumble a lot recently, but when Don Draper stands there as the Rolling Stones play, he is the picture of cool. It's funny how when you look at him, you want to be like that, even if you know you don't want to be like him. Halfway through the series and the decade, Don is taking a reset, and society has definitely shifted from this point on. It's visible in the clothes and the trends and the sound. So now we get to see if this pool baptism restart is going to propel Don toward a more positive future.
The scene kind of continues too as we see Don literally strutting through the office.
Don greets his secretary, Miss Blankenship, who's just had cataract surgery. "I was blind, but now I see," she tells him. A lot of the time, characters who speak to Don are telling him something about himself in the show, even if they seem to be talking about themselves. So Miss Blankenship's comment here seems to amplify the idea that Don is turning over a new leaf. He's going to be reborn. He's going to see himself clearly, and he is going to make better choices. I believe, right?
Yeah, and that seems to fit the lyrics, which assume that Miss Blankenship is referencing Amazing Grace. So it fits with this idea of Don's, relaunching here, and especially after we saw him hit some pretty low levels previously.
The next scene takes us to Joey and Stan lifting the vending machine in the hallway to try to retrieve Joey's watch. Peggy's watching them try to tilt it and bang on it, and she says she feels like Margaret Mead, who was a cultural anthropologist, and she wrote a book called Coming of Age. It's about adolescence and sexuality in Samoa. And this vending machine problem seems a little bit like a microcosm of everybody's issues. For example, Harry's just hanging around, so he's not missing anything, but he isn't helpful, and then he bails as soon as there's trouble and makes excuses. This machine is not reliable. The systems are breaking down. There's an undercurrent here.
And it's also the little boys club here, where previously perhaps it was Ken and Pete and Harry and Paul. And now it seems we've got the new generation where it's, Stan and Joey. And this results in Joan hearing the noise and coming around to sort them out.
She suggests, "Why don't you put another dime in the machine?" And Joey looks at her. "You think we didn't try that?" And okay, fair. I mean, that's a fair complaint. But Joey really takes it to another level, instantly escalating things with Joan. And he says, "Sorry, Mom." And it just doesn't go very well. She asks to speak with him privately in her office and talk to him about his behavior.
And Joey continues to be pretty rude and resistant to Joan. The memorable line here being that he doesn't need a madame from a Shanghai whorehouse to show him the ropes around the office. It's hard to imagine a ruder thing to say.
Oh, wait, I've got one. It's what he says right before that. I'm really shocked because when Joey offers in his defense that Stan's worse, I've agreed with him until we got to this scene. I thought Stan was a lot more flagrantly offensive. And I also noticed that Joey gets along well with Peggy. His issues seem to be very Joan specific. So I appreciate it's another character showing us how individuals don't just fit a type, because I'm going along thinking, oh, he's not sexist because he works really well with Peggy. But then he has this conflict with Joan. And when he says, "What do you do besides walking around here like you're trying to get raped?" Which I don't even know how you make that come out of your mouth to somebody. And it would be awful no matter what. But of course, what we know about her history with Greg, I feel like that comment has to be loaded with more pain for her. Of course, she doesn't let him see it.
Yeah, for whatever reason, Joey is not playing ball with Joan, and this seems to be a hill he's willing to die on. And I think it really illustrates Joan's peculiar position in this office, where she has responsibility for the office, but she lacks formal authority. Through force of her personality, her competence, she's able to get most everyone to march to her tune. But in this case, he's able to get away with these really rude things he says to her. And we can see Joan doing the slow burn in response.
Peggy shows up right after Joey leaves, and Joan acts irritated that Peggy's trying to cut through her office. And we've seen little breadcrumbs about this issue where Joan is dissatisfied with her office location and how it inconveniences her and diminishes her power. So it seems like a huge overreaction, but we've also seen it build up over time. And I really wish Joan would talk to Peggy about it and they could commiserate for a second. But Joan defines herself by her professional demeanor, so she will not tell Peggy what's really bothering her. She just takes it out on her about something. I mean, it's minor. I felt like Peggy was really patient with Joan, even though she's being short with her. She's had a lot of practice with Dawn being impatient, so that makes sense. But this is her professionalism, too. Peggy already understands that Joan's irritation is not about her.
And maybe this is indicative of my own sexism, but I feel that I'm always looking for them to be natural allies in the office. They want different things, but they're both women fighting an unfair man's world here. And, for various reasons, like this particular scene, there are obstacles and things that impede that alliance that I feel inside I'm looking for to develop, and just somehow it never gets there.
I share that same frustration, but I also am really appreciative that they're never set up to be sworn enemies either, because I think that's a really predictable trope, and we're not going to get that. That's not what it's about. So even though they're not best friends, it's also not like, let's take the two most identifiable females in the office and have them be at war with each other forever. And I'm really glad that Mad Men doesn't go that direction.
And they're both wrestling with the same fundamental problem, right? Responsibility without the authority. So, how do you solve that problem? I think they both take different approaches and have different strategies around it. But whether they recognize it in each other, they're both facing the same challenge, I think.
Next, we see Miss Blankenship carrying a bunch of bottles toward Don's office, but then he asks her to take them back to the storeroom. I'm really glad he says no to the liquor, but this poor woman could have used some help to carry all of that back. The way that she walks, Randy Heller's comedic timing is really amazing. And we learn that Jean's second birthday is this weekend. 2 years ago, Grandpa Jean had just died, and Don started seeing Suzanne while he was married, and he was living in the burbs, so a lot has changed for him. So this marker of Jean's second birthday, I'm sure it's bringing up a lot.
And the message from Betty, is underlining those changes, I think, too, where Betty is telling him he can't have his children this weekend. And I think there's probably a message in there from Betty that, he's not exactly welcome at Jean's second birthday either.
The next scene is Joan at her apartment. She gets home early, and Greg is packing to leave for basic training. Joan is sad about it, and she's worried for him. So this reminds us that she's got this on her mind that she's carrying around as well. He looks very confident and optimistic for somebody who's joining the U.S. military in 1965.
Greg doesn't seem to be held back by any sorts of doubts or even deep thoughts about what he's embarking upon. And he does seem well-intentioned here, trying to comfort Joan. When he can see that Joan is distraught and she asks, what am I going to do without you? Who am I going to talk to? When he says back to her, talk to your friends at work, this is really the complete wrong thing to say at this moment, and it starts Joan to weeping. And I'm sure Greg just can't fathom and assumes that this is just Joan's sadness at his departure.
I think Joan used to have friends at work, or maybe at least they were followers. But she's losing power there at the office. And she also no longer has that flirty social life she enjoyed with Carol, her roommate. And her married life hasn't brought Joan happiness the way it seems to be for Trudy. Later in the episode, we hear from Dawn that this quote, "We're ruined because we get these things and wish for what we had." And it feels like at least some of that is true for Joan, too.
I think it's really true for Joan, both socially and professionally, because she is in a position of high influence in the office, but like you point out, that's necessarily isolating from the others. She doesn't really have any peers, so she's caught between worlds there. And then we know on the marriage situation, these things that Joan has worked for and thought she wanted haven't really delivered the happiness and fulfillment that she probably assumed they would.
And we were talking about how Peggy and Joan share some things, but they don't share them with each other, that they have these things in common. And one of the things that struck me was when Joan asks, what am I going to do? Who am I going to talk to? It's that loneliness. And it reminded me of when Peggy broke up with Mark, even though Mark wasn't so great. And she said to Dawn, single, just that one word of, okay, now I'm going to have to face this and be strong. And this loneliness is really painful for both of them. And all the characters are suffering with that to some degree. It also feels really sad to me that Greg doesn't know any of Joan's friends or even her coworkers' names, or that she's having struggles at work. And then later he says, just pretend we're in some midtown hotel and we both snuck away for the afternoon. And we know that's exactly what she used to do with Roger. And maybe that was better, or maybe she's exhausted from worrying about Greg going to Vietnam, but it seems like a little escape for her to pretend. And Joan doesn't have a drinking problem like Dawn, but she is stuck and unhappy. Do you think she's going through a struggle of questioning who she wants to be every bit as much as Dawn, except she's generally better at holding herself together?
I think so. I think that's exactly what's going on. And like you say, she's just so much more put together and aware of how she wants to present professionally and even personally, that we don't get some of the self-destructive and risky behaviors that we see in Don Draper at his worst.
At Don's apartment, his dinner is canned beef stew with a Budweiser. So this is what his new leaf looks like.
That's the sad divorcee meal, apparently. The Vietnam War is playing on the evening news that's on his television, and Don is continuing to write in his journal and mentions Vietnam, hoping it's not another Korea. At this point, it's probably not on anyone's radar screen that Vietnam could end up being something far worse than Korea. And Don opines about Jean's birthday and mentions that he was conceived in a moment of desperation and born into a mess of a marriage situation.
I felt this voiceover narration was especially impersonal. Like even in his personal journal, he can't get out from behind his own mask. In your own journal, you wouldn't have to say that Jean was born into a mess or conceived in desperation, unless you are writing for some kind of audience outside yourself. So even there's no sense of how does Don feel about this baby? He hardly knows. How does he feel about being kept away from his birthday party or outside his children's lives. And I want more detail than that. And instead, it seems very sparse. Earlier in the episode, he was journaling that he was lazy and never wrote more than 250 words, which I thought was a very interesting point for a writer. But it leaves me cold, this detail here. I really want to open up inside him, and then I worry that there isn't anything in there when you're finally peeking in.
I took this narration here of just further reinforcing Dawn is seeking to make a change. And it felt to me, in recapping the circumstances of Jean's existence, it was just him, I think, shining a light and acknowledging that there were problems. Jean wasn't a solution to those problems and probably wasn't even a great idea given the problems. But that's water under the bridge at this point. And as he looks forward, he's got to figure out what is in his control to do or to change.
Don starts writing a list of things he wants to do, and even that seems fake to me. Is this a man who wants to climb Kilimanjaro? Maybe he wants that to be possible, but not to actually have to do it. And his second item, I think, is where his heart lives. He says he wants to gain a modicum of control over how I feel. We know that control is comfortable for him, but it's also so lonely. It feels like the second thing is such a big thing on his list, he doesn't need to add anything else. And I wish Don would have a bigger list and that his children would be on it. That would be maybe a great double dip question. What should Don add to his list of things he'd like to do at this point?
Well, it's interesting, too, because what led Don to this place? And he had a life in which he had control, and there was a lot of dishonesty and lies of omission, I suppose, at the very least. It makes me wonder, is control really his problem? Is that what he needs? And control towards what end? Because if he just builds a house of cards like he built previously, it feels to me like it's just a ticking time bomb that sooner or later the lies and omissions and the rest will come back to collapse it all on him. So I don't know. I'm wondering if gaining control is really where he should be starting here. Maybe there's a step before that to think about what are the ends? What am I looking for in life? Because just reconstructing what he had previously would be a waste of his time.
I agree. I wish he would seek authenticity because I think seeking control is just going to lead him back to the same masks and lonely sense of building a wall around himself. And that doesn't get him, I think, where he ultimately would like to go. And he doesn't even see that yet. So this does reveal he doesn't understand the problem yet, I don't think.
But it also feels real to me in the writing, which I probably say too much about this series. It makes sense to me that he wouldn't necessarily know any alternative. So he is, although he's not saying it explicitly, nostalgic for what he had built previously and the control he had, and longing to get back to that place, which maybe is a little bit of a play on his comment that I think is later in this episode, where he talks about, seeking to regain something that wasn't what you wanted or what you thought it was anyway. So it feels almost circular to me.
It's sort of like when you have children the first time and you know what it's like to handle your 3-year-old, but your 3-year-old changes and you don't know what it's like to deal with your 4-year-old. I think Don is seeking to go back to the thing that he knows because that seems more comfortable to him, because this unknown is very scary, especially when you're navigating it and you feel like you're by yourself.
And as well, you cannot get back to that prior place, right? The past is a foreign country. You can't go home. And that's such a barrier, especially as you long and attempt to recreate it. And in fact, the door is closed and can never be reopened.
Back at the office, the team is discussing Mountain Dew in Don's office. Ken, Peggy, Don, several other people are in there, and the camera focuses on a couple of slow motion close-ups of various people drinking, and Don's zeroing in on their drinks. They pour one and hand it to him, and he accepts it. I feel like this is a little bit heavy-handed, but I accept it. It's important to show that Don doesn't just jump into the pool once and get cured of alcoholism. This would be a thing he would be tracking and thinking about, and they're showing us it's not just that he's carrying Anna's death with him or his loneliness. His alcoholism is a real thing, and the fact that he's tracking this so hard, this is a problem for him.
It makes sense to me, too, that Don's attention would be wandering as he wrestles with, say, his yearning for a drink, contemplating his life and change and the rest. He snaps out of it when Joan comes in.
Ken is running Mountain Dew, and they had a witch's brew concept, but the client doesn't like it, so now they're going to have to come up with a new idea. Stan has been busy with a lot of projects, so Don asks Joan to see if Joey, who's a freelancer, can be added full-time for a couple of weeks. Joan takes this opportunity to suggest that Joey isn't the best fit, and she's always very discreet, so the fact that she's doing this in front of Peggy, Ken, Stan, and Don, that's a deliberate shot on her part.
Yes, and this is where we see Joan trying to exercise her power and influence in a way with those in authorities to see if she can cut off this extension of Joey's contract. Doesn't seem like Don Draper is all that interested, and he seems to dismiss it as, boys will be boys in terms of those comments.
Yeah, that's some great managerial technique right there, Don. How bad does it have to be before Joan brings it up? Don should know better here. I also notice that Peggy, who has a pretty good working relationship with Joey, she doesn't speak up for Joey directly, but she does pose a couple of questions about what Joan is saying in the moment. She says, he's disrespectful in front of the girls. And Peggy says, really? So she's not just blindly accepting Joan's version. It's not a huge pushback, but to me, that was interesting because she reads what Joan is doing here.
Peggy's walking a fine line here because in some ways she's one of the boys gathered round here in a creative session around Mountain Dew. And then in another aspect, she's Joey's supervisor and hearing a complaint about Joey from Joan, but it's in front of an audience here. So it does feel like a sticky situation for Peggy.
At the end of the meeting, Joan says something about a very blue joke Joey was telling. And Stan tries to retell it. He says, oh, I know the joke. And he starts to say it. And Peggy cuts him off. She says, are we done here? And Peggy is not a fragile flower, but she's speaking up to say she's not interested in whatever crude joke the boy's boy is about to offer up. And that's new. She used to just put up with it. It's not changing the system overnight, and it doesn't change attitudes instantly, but I feel like that's a step here that she's making.
It's definitely changing the dynamic in these meetings and conversations now that there's somebody who's calling out these blue jokes or simply saying, look, they don't have any work-related purpose, so let's skip them. It's definitely a different dynamic that's evolving. And it's also, I think, a position of informal leadership from Peggy to, make these comments, because they're certainly not going to come from the old boys network.
Across the office, Harry is talking to Joey about the possibility of him being cast in a TV show. Joey doesn't seem to have any interest in this, but it turns out Harry gave a director in Hollywood a picture of Joey without Joey's permission or knowledge from the Christmas party. You're so handsome, Harry tells him. And all I get from this is Harry being a schmoozing account man who's always trying to set up a deal. I mean, I am sure there's some director Harry would like to suck up to for future favors. And so I think he's just happy to bring this director casting candidates. But when Joey walks out, he thinks Harry is into him. What did you think?
Yeah, I had the same impression as you. I don't think Harry is coming on to Joey in any way. I think he's just trying to play Hollywood, and he likes to play that role in the office. And it's kind of funny to me, Joey's reaction. I think Harry would be horrified if he knew how Joey was viewing his conversation.
I like Peggy's take when she goes, yes, Joey, everyone wants you. I do appreciate that Peggy goes directly to Joey after the Mountain Dew meeting She doesn't hold him blameless, but she cares enough to finesse this. And she says, "What did you do to Joan? Because you shouldn't have." It starts to come out. Joey says, "There's a Joan at every company. My mother was a Joan, always telling people what to do." And it makes a little more sense now. Joey has Joan in this box of people I don't like. That makes a lot more sense than that he's been bothered by any specific thing Joan has done. But Peggy literally said, "Chop, chop, Joey," and that was okay. It's weird how bias isn't logical.
Joey doesn't take Peggy's advice here, which is don't cross Joan, because I think Peggy is aware of her power and influence. And if Joan is gunning for you in that office, that's probably a place you don't want to be. Joey sort of puts up the hand and seems to insist that he'll behave the way he wants to behave, and he's not worried about Joan.
In the next scene, we see Betty and Henry are out for dinner after the theater, and they're meeting with a potential political contact. Betty is all smiles, being the arm candy, until she looks over and notices Dawn and Bethany are sitting at a table across the room.
And I think this ticks all the rage boxes for Betty, right? So it's her ex dating a woman who's much younger than him, who in some ways physically bears a resemblance to Betty, but is younger and hasn't had children. And I think we really get a sense that Betty is still very much entangled with Don Draper. And now her heart is pounding and her rage is boiling to see this guy, as she'll describe later, in living the life she thinks he always wanted to live. Betty just can't let go of him.
The camera cuts over to Dawn and Bethany's conversation, and it seems like maybe they have just seen The Odd Couple, which premiered on Broadway in 1965. Bethany asks if Dawn is a Felix or an Oscar. Felix is a neat freak who criticizes everybody, and Oscar is irresponsible and messy, but he seems to enjoy his life. Dawn answers he'd rather be an Oscar, but he's probably a Felix. So again, we always talk about who is Don Draper, and Bethany doesn't get anywhere close to the truth. She at least senses she's not where she wants to be because she says, "Every date feels like a first date with you." Don isn't letting his guard or his mask down with her, even though he's trying to be this guy. He's trying to do what people do. They went to a Broadway show. They're having dinner. Look how normal Don Draper is. And the truth is, he's irresponsible and he's critical.
It's also interesting to me how Bethany takes the time to walk him through like how a relationship starts, and says, it takes intense, prolonged contact. Don't you want to be close to anyone? These are all things that any adult knows. Young, forceful Bethany is going to hit this head on with him and really, I think, try and call him out here to say, if you're going to go for this, then I need to see that evidence of effort from you. Otherwise, there's no point to this. And I agree with you. It feels like Dawn is not saying anything to outrage her or refute what she's saying, but it also doesn't really feel like he's leaning forwards or trying to make a real effort either.
No, I feel the vulnerability when Bethany says, "I get excited when you call and then I don't hear from you." And he says, basically, "You're pushing too hard. You're asking for too much too soon." And she already knows he's not that into her because he would call her if he were. And she just wants to believe something else about him. But I can't really blame him. I think Bethany looks like Betty all over again. She's not a healthy path for Dawn. I think she would expect the veneer and she would be continually disappointed if they built this into a relationship. Speaking of Betty, Henry and Betty make their way over to Dawn and Bethany's table and they have some chilly introductions. There's a moment when Bethany realizes Betty is Dawn's ex-wife and she asks, "What? Her?" How did you interpret that reaction?
I think just as Betty is looking at cosmetic side of Don Draper and sees him living the life and dating these young women, Betty is what Bethany aspires to. This trophy wife of this successful executive who's glamorous and going to the best places and being paraded, around on his arm. So I think Bethany's impressed by Betty. I think it further confirms to her that Don Draper is the kind of man that Bethany imagines or fantasizes about getting for herself.
On the first watch, I found Bethany's reaction a little confusing because at first she seems to have a negative or disappointed response, and then she seems pleased. And I wondered if Bethany thought Betty was like her, and maybe she thought it was kind of creepy that he picked such a lookalike or stand in. Or maybe she noticed the resemblance and worried if he could reject somebody like Betty, he would do the same to her. But in the commentary, Matthew Weiner doesn't seem to intend their similar look to be part of the story at all. It seems that Bethany is surprised and worried because Betty is so stunning and put together. And then Bethany just shakes that off and turns on the smiles to say, like, okay, I have what it takes to win this man, so I'm going to go for it.
And it is an ironic triangle here, right? So we've got Betty raging against Dawn, living the life. We've got Bethany aspiring to the life that presumably Betty and Dawn had at one time. As viewers, we know the truth behind the Betty and Dawn relationship, and nothing is as it appears. So it is, I think, all wrapped around that theme of this episode about people seeking what they want and perhaps getting some version of it that doesn't line up to the ideal that they imagined.
At Henry and Betty's table, Betty can't stop looking over at Bethany and Dawn laughing together. Henry is talking about his long-term political future, and he's happy to have Betty there until he notices her focus. And I'm calling this out as unrealistic. Betty Francis would know, as sure as she'd wear a scarf in a convertible, that the ultimate rule of X sightings is that you are living your best life. She would not be pouty and sad. She would be laughing too loudly. She would be incredibly bubbly. She would be thrilled with her amazing life. If not in front of Dawn, then for sure in front of Bethany. Dawn is the man with the mask, but Betty is also about image and performance, and she would totally keep herself together until she was out of view, I think.
I agree with you 100%. For the purposes of this episode, she's focused on what she's lost in the dissolution of her marriage to Don Draper. And simultaneously, she's not focused on any of the positives that she's gained with Henry. So it's completely a retrograde look as to what she's lost and hatred towards her ex. And it makes sense to me that this starts to wind Henry up.
I definitely believe the next scene where Betty pulls herself together in a bathroom stall, and she chose to leave Dawn, but it's still uncomfortable this first time seeing him live his new life, seeing him actually with another woman. I do feel like it's an overreaction to some extent. Did you?
I do, but I guess I'm taking it in the context of what I'm supposed to understand of the character, and it just feels to me like a huge flashing neon sign that Betty is not over Dawn. She's still in this grieving period, and it's a problem. She's got to stop looking backwards and start looking forwards.
I have to think some of it is also frustration that Don is not hiding away pining in misery for her. That's what he's supposed to do, right? That's supposed to be Don's punishment for mistreating her. And instead, he's running around with young women and having the time of his life, she thinks. So I wonder if Betty's upset is not just jealousy, but a feeling of injustice, that he did that while he was married, and now he does it, and he's still not even looking at her, and it's like she never existed to him.
I totally think that's part of it. Isn't this all a little childish on Betty's part?
I think we really see that in the next scene when Henry and Betty are having this ride home in the car. It's not fun. Betty's had too much to drink and she's pouting, and she does definitely have a childish look on her here, I think. And we've seen her have more than one miserable ride home with Dawn before. But this is a significant disagreement between Betty and Henry here. I appreciate, though, it seems a lot healthier than the silence and the pretense Betty and Dawn had.
Well, and I think it starts with Henry trying to be constructive in his comments. She needs to get over Dawn and move forward and put all that behind her. And we can see that she's wrapped up, and she says she hates him. Henry says that hate is a very strong word and offers up that he hates the Nazis, but he doesn't hate his ex. And I think what Henry's alluding to there is just the need to coexist, especially in a case where you share children. if you hate the other person, it's going to make it very difficult to manage and deal with the things you need to coordinate, even now that the marriage is broken up. Betty seems wrapped up in her emotional need to vent and to hate against Don Draper. And Henry is looking for, I think, a more mature, balanced perspective. Let's minimize the upset with Don Draper and just move on with life, because regardless of how she may feel about Don's in the rearview mirror. Henry is the one sitting with her in a car right now.
I've heard the writers say in the commentary often that in Mad Men, they write so you can believe in both points of view of any two people in an argument. And I understand Betty's discomfort, but I am more with Henry here. I think she overreacted. He's being honest about why it upsets him. I don't love that he ends the fight with "Shut up, Betty, you're drunk." Not cool. But his feelings are hurt, and he's used up a lot of his patience. And Betty's letting him down here. Her job is to keep house and raise kids and go out to dinner to be sparkly and to love him. And she failed to sparkle. And given the evidence before him, I understand why Henry might doubt her investment in him and in their future. And he even says, maybe we rushed into this. So that is very worrisome from this guy who's been super stable. Do you think Henry deserves better than Betty? I mean, he's honest, he cares about her, and she doesn't seem to appreciate him very much.
I think he's right when he says that Dawn is taking up too much space in her life at this point. And she is the one who controls how much space she lets Don Draper take up in her life. So I think he's really just trying to help her solve that problem under the assumption that in her life where Dawn is not taking up too much space, then she'll be in a position to appreciate and invest and focus on him. And her unwillingness to even entertain that idea that, she's the one who's in control here and it's really her problem, not Don Draper's problem. I think that's just getting on his nerves and irritating him.
Dawn and Bethany seem to have a more pleasant ride home together in their cab. I want Bethany to be more interesting than she is, and I'm pretty sure Dawn does too. Not that that's going to hurry him out of that cab, though.
No, it seems like Bethany wants to make a move here physically to spark Dawn's interest and see if she can't light a fire of desire that, to this point, if it exists, Dawn's been riding the brake pedal. So, she gets amorous in the taxi. He seems none too dissatisfied with this turn of events in his taxi ride home.
I find the voiceover narration pretty clunky in this section. He describes Bethany as a sweet girl who wants me to know her, but I already do. And it would be interesting to get exactly what he thinks of her, but it still feels pretty bland. I just know he's judging the way she pronounces the word nuclear, or some story she told him gives him a new ad idea, but we don't get any witticisms or any of that stuff. And I don't know if Don ever really does know anybody, even if he thinks he knows Bethany's whole story already. Granted, she's pretty shallow, but Don is so self-absorbed. Everybody else is his personal mirror.
And I also don't see anything from Bethany that would spark Don Draper's deeper interest. And maybe Suzanne is another exception on that front. But if I think about, Midge and Rachel and Bobby, all of them had really strong personalities and sort of a sharp intellectual presence, which I think, in addition to their beauty, really was attractive to Don Draper. It seems to me that as lovely as Bethany is, she's not bringing any of that to the table. So combining that with the scar tissue and this sort of Don Draper in recovery, both emotional recovery from a relationship and then recovery from alcoholism, it just seems there's too many hurdles in the way to him feeling anything strong towards Bethany.
It's interesting that Don Draper seems drawn to women who have a bit of a darkness or complexity to them. And he married Betty Draper, who, before their marriage, I think certainly she has had her issues growing up, but I think her presentation of being all light and sunshine, and he told Anna about how she laughs. I think he wants to believe in this person and how great it will be. And yet the person he's really drawn to is somebody who's more like him, somebody who has a hidden, darker self and isn't just that sunshiny person. And I think Bethany is only that. And John Hamm has a great voice for narration. And I can't believe I'm going to say I don't like writing in Mad Men because I love writing in Mad Men. But I am not a fan of this cliched detective vibe in the journal voiceover here. It's like plenty of dames in the Barbizon, see? And they were all bad news. That's my hard-boiled detective voice. But Don Draper's thing is that he's mysterious and you're never sure who he is. But if we get interior monologue, he shouldn't be as vacant as Bethany. I know there are fans who really like this episode and this style, but it's not for me.
Well, and this is a part where that narration from Don Draper, I wonder if it rings true to the character because the part where he says, people tell you who they are, but we ignore it. We project feelings onto people. Okay, I think those things are generally true, but they don't feel particularly profound, nor necessarily all that salient to Don Draper in particular, at least from my perspective.
Oh, I disagree on that. I think a lot of the relationships, I think that's coming up actually in a later scene where the women who encounter Don Draper know better, but they want him to be somebody else, right? Like, as he wanted Betty to be and Betty wanted him to be, Bethany clearly wants him to be somebody he's not. So I think that's an interesting line.
Oh, it's not that it's not true or interesting, but it's obvious. Like it's just stating first principles here. I don't see how it tells us anything we didn't already know or moves anything forward.
When Dawn comes into work the next day, Faye is talking on the payphone, and Dawn overhears her breaking up. We don't know the guy or hear him speak, but I love her fight with him, especially when she goes, I want my key back, and I don't want you complaining that I don't cook, because I don't cook. After we saw what happened with Betty's pot roast and Trudy's chicken, Faye is not signing up for that role. You are manage your own meat, sir. She's this other person besides Peggy who's expanding what it means to be feminine in 1965. I love it. Maybe she can star in an Angelique commercial in 15 years.
Matt Weiner comments on the Yiddish saying, go shit in the ocean. I don't really know exactly what that means, but it sounds suitably rude and aggressive.
I don't think Faye is the most endearing character on this show, but I find her really interesting because she's a person I recognize, and yet I rarely see this person on screen. She's not trying to be Betty or Trudy, and she's not apologizing for that, and I find her interesting because of that. At the Francis household, Betty wants to make up with Henry, and he says all the right things, but he still is distant with her, and you can tell. It feels like a bit of a role reversal as Betty tries to calm Henry the way Dawn used to do with Betty. She's a little bit overconfident. She expects him to forgive her immediately. And she lies, and this is Dawn's playbook. She tells Henry, Dawn was the only man I'd ever been with, which I feel like maybe that's not the way to go when he's so defensive. Don't bring that up, Betty.
Right. And really seems to confirm the diagnosis that Henry had, which was, she's got too much space in her head for Don Draper at this point. I think also this scene really shows us that Betty can be emotional and get spun up about something in a situation, but now she's unspun and ready to get on with things. Henry runs a lot cooler, but when he gets to that place where he's angry or frustrated, it takes a lot longer to get him there, and it takes him a lot longer to come back down. The things he said and the things he thinks weren't in a fit of anger or alcohol buzz from the prior evening, but our concerns and frustrations that he has here the next morning. It's tough seeing him be cool to Betty in this way because to this point, it seems that he's always been sort of leaning in to try and look after her and help navigate her to a better place. And I think we can really see the depths of his frustration here that he's still struggling with where he perceives her mind to be.
And as Henry leaves for work, I find his move in the garage a little bit endearing. If he supported Betty through all of her nonsense and he didn't have any petty feelings, I think he would be boring. If he gave in to them all the time, he'd be harried. But when he sees Dawn's belongings in boxes in the garage and not so accidentally drives the car into them, I think we get it. I get it.
I wonder what's in Don Draper's cardboard boxes. Does he, have lawn stuff for Halloween or what's in those?
Dawn didn't do anything to Henry. In fact, you could argue Dawn should be more bitter at him than the other way around. But I think Henry is not ever going to be quite as cool as Don Draper standing outside of the New York Athletic Club as the Rolling Stones blare their latest hit. And Henry knows it, and I think this is his self-doubt kicking in. Is he the man who can replace Don Draper? We know Don's messy truth, and I think we could definitely argue Henry is a better man.
Speaking of better men, the next scene takes us back to the office where we've got Joey mixing Mountain Dew with vodka, trying to come up with a cocktail. Peggy reminds him that a cocktail needs to have 3 ingredients.
Vodka and Mountain Dew is an emergency. I didn't know that Mountain Dew started in Virginia as a mixer with whiskey. It was in the 1940s, and it got acquired by a different company before Pepsi got it in 1964. And it kept its hillbilly marketing motif that they're discussing until 1973 before it switched to sort of an outdoorsy theme. I'll put a link to an article on our episode webpage.
Our next scene takes us to Joan entering Lane's office and letting him know that Joey is being extended per Don Draper's decision. She also complains about the candy vending machine.
I expected Joan to press a financial case against Joey going full-time for 3 weeks with Lane here, but she doesn't. She goes after the vending machine, but Lane loves it and wants to add another one so people will stay in and work through lunch. This running gag is a little bit cynical because earlier Joan asked the guys if they called the help number about the machine being stuck. And now Lane goes, "Are people using the help number?" Help is not coming. They are all on their own with all their problems, snack and otherwise. For Joan, the vending machine is not a solution to their problem. It's just another problem.
Back in the bullpen, Joey's noticed Joan is in Lane's office and speculates about what they might be doing in there, leading to him drawing an obscene sketch.
Peggy tells him to stop and he won't. So Peggy gives them work directions for Mountain Dew and stands up and she leaves. Again, I see her standing up against this behavior instead of just feeling grateful to be in the room while it's happening. Stan calls her out for being a wet blanket as Peggy leaves, and Joey replies, "Ugh, you love her." We haven't really seen any evidence of that, but it's interesting. Joey notices that Stan seems to be on board with Peggy, just as Joey has seemed to be.
And we also see Joey disregarding Peggy's comment. He's not taking any advice on this front. He's behaving the way he chooses to.
In Don's office, we see him taking a call from Henry. They're both polite but cool and overly formal. Henry says he bought a boat, and Don needs to get his things out of the garage so he can store it there. He offers to put Don's things in storage, but Don says no, he'll come and get them. Don put a Cadillac in the garage, but this fictional boat is some one-upmanship. And Don owns this house that Henry is living in, so rude, Henry. But I think we understand why Henry thinks removing traces of Don from the house will help him get off Betty's mind, or at least make him less visible to Henry. It's pretty ridiculous because Don Draper is all over that house. I mean, the boxes in the garage are the least of his imprint.
Well, and it's also, as Matt Weiner points out in his commentary, an act of dominance by Henry because he's going to push Don to get his stuff out of the house. And then in terms of timing, since Sunday is Jean's party, Henry suggests that Saturday would be best, implying that Don Draper wouldn't be coming to the party on Sunday. And again, I think reinforcing that vibe of Don is not welcome at Jean's second birthday party.
For a moment, though, it felt to me like Henry was going to welcome Don to join them for the birthday party. And I feel like if Betty hadn't been so upset at dinner, maybe Henry would have, because he's, again, so much more reasonable. He talks about his relationship with his ex and sharing custody of their daughter. I'm frustrated with Don a lot, but he's right to be annoyed with Henry here. He's paying for the house, Gene is his son, and Henry is trying to dictate the terms. It's unfair. And if Don didn't carry so much guilt and this feeling he deserves to be punished, I don't think he would stand for it. But he doesn't stand up for himself here. He's just slamming the receiver down. He looks at the bottle and he overcomes it. He asks his secretary for some coffee instead. I feel like this was his version of Betty's bathroom meltdown, and he didn't drink over it, so it's a win.
Back in Joan's office, Peggy has now lost 30 cents to the vending machine. Peggy complains about it, and Joan isn't all that sympathetic. And then Joan notices Joey's picture taped to the glass wall.
I'm not calling that number, Peggy says. Nobody ever answers. And I appreciate the vending machine as a symbol because Joan continues to tell people to call the vending machine number even though it doesn't work. That's the system. Just like sexual harassment in the office is a system. And Peggy looks at that and says, I'm not doing that. It doesn't work. So right then at that moment, as they look up, Stan and Joey have pressed the gross tally-ho drawing of Joan and Lane to the glass. Joan goes right into the creative lounge to confront them, but nobody will admit to being the artist. Stan and Joey are laughing at her.
I love Joan's line to them when she says that she can't wait till they're in Vietnam and that they should know that they're not dying for her because she never liked them.
I thought it was maybe not up to her usual caliber, but I guess it's a lot easier to slam Paul Kinsey. She stays calm and cool and she walks out, but it's so awful to have experienced that. Somebody went out of his way to personalize the insult on top of the regular stream of insults. Yuck. Peggy checks in with Joan, but Joan just says, I'm not going home, and Peggy can tell she doesn't want to talk. So then she turns on Joey and she says, I told you not to do that. And then Peggy decides she is going to do something about it. She takes the drawing to Don. She lets him know it's disrespectful to Joan and to me. I do like Don's line when he sees the drawing and critiques it. He goes, narrative force perspective. Are you sure Joey wrote this?
What's interesting to me is Peggy's going to Don seeking an authority to make a ruling on this. And Dawn just bats it right back into her lap and tells her to do what she wants. Yell at him, fire him. I don't think Peggy was expecting to have this question put to her in that way. Dawn explains that she doesn't really want him involved in this because then that just diminishes her power and turns her into a tattletale, lacking power. Really, Dawn's doing her a favor here in terms of her earning some respect and authority because he's thrusting this problem into her lap and now she's going to have to address it.
It's a funny duality because I agree that I think Dawn's advice to her about retaining her power is helpful. But at the same time, Dawn, who just told Joan that boys will be boys, he might not approve of the vending machine, but it's not his problem. The rampant sexual harassment in the office, where he is a partner and a perpetrator, I mean, he's not looking after that. He's not doing anything about that. He's not standing up and marching over there and fixing it. And it's 1965, I know. But still, this is not a problem he wants to involve himself in because it is not important to him. As you say, he reminds Peggy that, you can do something about this and it will elevate your status. And that's true, but I wish he cared more.
And I think there's another truth that respect has to be earned. It isn't given. And this is Peggy exactly at that inflection point. Is she going to now earn some respect because she can't coast along on having it given or assumed? She's got to grab it and take it at this point. It's funny to me, too, when Faye comes in the office and Dawn is quickly crumpling the picture because he does not want Faye seeing this obscene drawing from Joey.
If only they could get rid of all of that so easily. Peggy calls Joey into her office and he apologizes to her. She says, good. Now go apologize, meaning to Joan. But he won't because that will mean admitting he drew it. You did do it. I told you not to. That's about as close as we get to our truth call out for this episode. Joey won't see it that way. He insists that it was funny. What if it were Dawn on his knees, Peggy asks. this is a reset for her, too. This is her pushing back against this heavy system she's been dealing with her whole career. So when she asks that question, she's challenging Joey to see things differently. See, I don't like working with women because you have no sense of humor, Joey answers. So unlike Miss Blankenship, he is still blind. He does not see.
And I think at this point, Joey has an easy out here. He can escape being fired by simply apologizing. And I think what gets him fired is his refusal to apologize, but more importantly, his disrespect for Peggy, because now he's putting her in a position where either he's allowed to ignore what she tells him to do or he's not. And she has no choice. She's given him an out to escape a more severe punishment, and he has not taken it, which has now boxed her in. And if she's going to demand respect and exercise authority here, then she has no alternative. And she terminates him.
This is a woman who got naked with Stan in the hotel room to prove a point. She's not backing down. No way. And Joey pretends to be all reasonable then at that point. Like, come on, this is crazy. And Peggy is not enjoying this. She liked working with him, I think. But you're right. She has to do it. This is about her self-respect, and she's going to maintain it. And then he dumps a box of her files onto the floor so he can use it for his things on his way out. But sure, let's talk about how Betty is childish and immature in this series.
I think Joey makes a calculation that he can push Peggy to the brink, and when push comes to shove, she won't shove. And he got it wrong. And as soon as she terminates him, exactly, we can see the realization on his face. He's just gone over the cliff, and now there's no retrieving it. I love the tension of this scene and this moment for Peggy, because I think anybody who's been a supervisor has faced some sort of similar challenge or moment. Are you going to exercise that power or will you not? And I like the fact that when Peggy exercises it here, it's righteous, it's appropriate, and it's not her just going on an ego trip. And I think when Joey tells the other guys later what's happened to him, you can feel the chill go through the air because they've realized there's something strong and steely in Peggy's spine.
I remember when I first saw this episode, I was surprised because my sense was that Stan was way worse than Joey. And I didn't expect her to fire somebody who seemed kind of like a friend. But I think that makes her choice so much stronger because she's standing for something. It would be easier to fire Stan. I think it's important to remember that Joan tried to fire Jane for acting inappropriately and she got overruled. We know from the earlier meeting that Stan is stretched really thin on work already. So on first watch, I was hoping, oh no, will Pete or Roger or somebody come back and overturn Peggy's decision here?
In his commentary, Matt Weiner says that this isn't an act of feminism, it's an act of power and a response to a lack of respect. And that really fits with my perception as a viewer of it. This has got nothing to do with men or women in this moment. This is a supervisor telling a direct report to do something then he's refusing to do.
Across the office, Faye and Dawn are talking about Fillmore Auto Parts. Remembering her breakup phone call this morning, Faye doesn't know he knows. Dawn hints they could go out and eat something, and they can bring the work if she wants. But Faye recalibrates that. She says if he wants to ask her out, he can do it properly, not just at the last minute because it's convenient. We saw Bethany pushing for more calls and more attention from Dawn, but I feel like this from Faye he respects, and I think it's just because he's more interested in her. And she respects herself, not to jump at the last second. And now they have a Saturday night they're both looking forward to.
And also, let's put this in the context that Faye has previously rejected 2 come-ons from Don Draper. And then even here on the third, she tells him he needs to ask her out properly, not just as something tacked on to the end of the workday. So, as we talked about what is it that interests Don Draper in women, I think it's this sort of attitude and self-respect that Faye has. And I think he's more interested, having been brought up short twice previously and been told to do it the right way here the third time. I think all that adds to the appeal for Don Draper rather than putting him off.
I wonder if we could even count it as 3 times because she went in to talk to him at the Christmas party, and I think he said, "Do you wanna get out of here then?" And then he was super drunk after the Cleos, and then there was that moment in the kitchen with the sake. So she definitely has rebuffed opportunities multiple times, yeah. Back at Betty's house, Francine comes over with a potato salad bowl, and I love the specificity of the neighbors in their lives. Francine, for plot purposes, is really just coming in for a scene to support Betty here, but she has her own life experience. She was outside and the mosquitoes got her, and she was socializing somewhere with potato salad. I just love her character as she walks in fully formed. And Betty is very open with Francine. She doesn't need a journal voiceover. She reveals she told Dawn about the party. So, unlike Henry, she did leave that option open for Dawn to come. But she does say she doesn't want him to come and ruin it. She's probably worried he'll bring a date.
Betty does grouse to Francine about running into Dawn in the city. It's interesting that Francine's reaction is, that sad bastard chasing after these younger women who are obviously not appropriate to his dating pool. But it's interesting to see Betty's emotional response back, where she says, just an act. He's living the life.
Betty adds to that, he's living the life. He doesn't get to have this family and that. And I think that's a really important line defining her issue with him. Betty is still stuck in the same role she was in, but now at least she has a husband who talks to her and who's mostly honest with her. This is some pretty mean scorekeeping that if Don is going to run around, his family life has to be miserable because life is just not fair if Don gets to be happy. I mean, honestly, I think I would still be mad at him too, but I hope I would see it the way Francine does, that Betty has a lot to lose and nothing to gain from investing in Don's misery. I also really like this quick line where Francine says, "Oh, Betty, you have terrible luck with entertaining." And Betty just nods very seriously. She agrees with her. So we look back at Sally's birthday where Dawn disappeared, or the dinner party with the Heineken story, or the political meeting when Henry didn't show up. This perfect housewife really has had some unhappy hosting stories.
And I think Betty is also really irritated by the fact that Don remains a hero to the kid. All these awful things that he did in that relationship, and none of those matter to the kids. They just see him as their father. He's a hero. She's busy doing the day-to-day and having to punish them and get them ready and all the rest of it. And he's just a source of gifts and fun and adventure.
This next scene in the elevator with Peggy and Joan is so frustrating to me. I want them to get along and be allies, and we just don't get to have that. Peggy really wants credit from Joan here. Joan's not going to bring it up, but Peggy wants to have that moment where they agree the drawing was terrible, and now Joey's gone, and it's for the better given what they put up with for years. But Joan is subtracting credit. She's not giving it. If she hates what Joey did, she also hates that Peggy has more comparative power than she does.
Wouldn't you agree that Peggy terminates Joey not because Joey was disrespectful to Joan? So for Peggy to now present it to Joan as if, oh, I got rid of this guy who was disrespectful to us and is disrespectful to women, that's not really what happened there and what got Joey walked out of the building. And Joan is smart enough to recognize that truth, and she's not going to let Peggy get away with it in this moment.
Oh, I don't see it that way. I think that's wrapped up in it. I don't think it was solely that. I think she was concerned about it. I agree with you, what you said earlier about how it was his insubordination to her that made her make the final call. And that's what Joan accuses her of doing. She says, "What's wrong with you? I defended you." And Joan says, "You defended yourself." And Peggy says, "Fine, that cartoon was disgusting." And that's true as well. It was a justifiable firing. We're used to seeing Joan issue advice to Peggy that doesn't quite match. And Joan is so composed, it would be really weird if she just collapsed and confided in Peggy about her husband going to Vietnam or the things on her mind. But for her to stand here and take shots at Peggy, who points out it's the same result, right? Joan already has the power to get Joey fired if she wanted to. And then she says, "Oh, Peggy, you just did it to be a big shot." And I don't think that's the whole truth.
Yeah, I don't think Peggy was trying to be a big shot at all, but Peggy had to assert her authority. I do agree as well. I think, when Joan says that, she's been exposed as a meaningless secretary, and I think that is what grinds Joan's gears here. She could have gotten Joey fired or at least put the hounds on him to eventually have him out of there. But she has to do it indirectly and work through other people who have the authority that she lacks. And I think she does have discomfort with the fact that Peggy is starting to carve off slices of authority that Joan has never had, because she is really blazing a trail here. And it's not the path to power and influence that Joan has had to carve out for herself in that office. And I think carved out very successfully, although in this particular circumstance, for this duration of time that we saw, it did seem to be a rather dissatisfying one for Joan.
I hate that this meme of Joan and Peggy in the elevator is used to misrepresent their situation so often. The part where Joan says, "All you've done is prove to them that I'm just a meaningless secretary and you're a humorless bitch." And neither of those things are true. And Peggy is doing more than that. I think Joan is wrapped up in this old existing system that it will never change, that they can still draw another cartoon, she says. But Peggy is taking action to change it, both because she saw herself as defending Joan and because the cartoon was disgusting, as she says. And Joan doesn't want to owe Peggy anything. I respect her pride, but it disappoints me.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think Joan's comments are fair or accurate, but I think that's the emotional state Joan's in at this point. So she's going to vent on Peggy in this circumstance. And as you pointed out at the start of this scene, it catches Peggy completely off guard. This is not what she expected to hear out of Joan.
Peggy doesn't get a Cleo, and she doesn't get to make a friend out of Joan when she fires Joey. 0 and 2. We get voiceover with Don in the next scene on Saturday when he drives over to his old house. He says, "When a man walks into a room, he brings his whole life with him." And that seemed to me like a contrast with what Bert said about a man is whatever room he's in, as if you could change masks effortlessly and that's a way of being. So for Don to say his whole life goes with him, you can't outrun your past or trade out masks, that seems like that could be a huge positive turn for him.
And isn't Don Draper's problem really the masks? If he could be authentic about his origins and grapple with the issues that remain with him, he could be a better person, I think, and have a more satisfying life. But he's found it easier to wallpaper over all that and wear the mask, to mix my metaphors here. And wearing the mask maybe solves the immediate problem, but it doesn't deal with the substance at all.
We see Don's boxes on the side of the road and Henry mowing the lawn outside. They don't say anything to each other. Don picks up the boxes and takes them directly to a dumpster unopened. "We're flawed because we want so much more," the narration says. And I think that's a very interesting line, because you might imagine that wanting gives you drive and leads to accomplishment instead of the lack of satisfaction, if you will.
It's a lonely scene as Henry comes in the house from mowing the lawn and removes his shirt, but he doesn't speak or address Betty in any way. And we can tell he's still struggling and feeling frustration with her.
Betty looks at him as he walks past. She's frosting a cake. That takes us back to Marriage of Figaro so much. Don was drinking and reluctantly building a playhouse. That woman is never picking up a cake again. She's got that on lock. So you feel how much better this situation is, that she's with a guy who does what she expects and there's no secret other life alongside of it. I guess the question is Henry enough for her?
Back at Don Draper's apartment, we see him drinking alone at home again as he awaits his date that evening with Faye.
He says in narration, as he pours a drink, "We're ruined because we get these things and wish for what we had." But I can't really believe he wants to be married to Betty anymore. I think he just liked the normalcy and stability of that life. Because as Helen Bishop said, it's terrifying to realize you're the one in control. You could go out and do anything. And now he's not married, so what is he going to do and see and try? Is he going to drink in his apartment forever? Is he going to climb Mount Kilimanjaro?
That evening, Dawn's at dinner with Faye. Dawn admits to being a little out of sorts lately.
When Dawn and Faye first arrive, she says he smells like chlorine. So he's keeping up his swimming habit. And I'm so optimistic for him here because swimming seems like a good thing. Faye seems like a good choice. He's cutting back on drinking. And this seems good. Faye reveals that while her father isn't in the mob, he knows a guy or two. And Dawn asks what he's like, and she says her father is a handsome, two-bit gangster like Dawn. She gives him a real smile when she says that. But earlier in the episode, Dawn's voiceover line was, "People tell you who they are, but we ignore it because we want them to be who we want them to be." We know Betty wanted Dawn to be a certain someone, and he wasn't. And I think Faye wants Dawn to be someone, and we don't know at this point if he can be. She knew he was trouble when he walked in. Credit to Taylor. But she's here anyway. So here is Faye believing in Dawn and all his new leaf turnover, starting to be a better man. But he's telling her who he is. So is she just ignoring it?
I don't think she knows how broken he is and all his problems. So I think in many ways she's just dealing with the veneer or mask of Don Draper for the most part. She hasn't been behind the curtain to this point.
As Dawn mentions he feels out of sorts, Faye says, usually for her that means there's a significant event on the horizon. And Dawn reveals it's his 2-year-old's birthday this weekend, and he's not welcome at the celebration. That Jean thinks that man, Henry, is his father. And maybe that's okay. So Dawn could walk away and not be part of Jean's life, and he could grow up thinking Henry is his dad. And Faye tells him all he knows, meaning Jean, all he knows of the world is what you show him. And I think that's a very nice way to say, do the right thing because your kids can see you and they're watching.
Yeah, I think so. And I think Don Draper is looking for a bit of a cop-out here. And I think that comment by Faye helps steer him back to where he should be as the present father of his 2-year-old, rather than making excuses as to why he can avoid showing up.
Faye tells a fable about the sun's gentle warmth being more persuasive and satisfying in results than the wind blowing harshly. I feel like she's talking about their dating relationship here, that kindness works better than force or just assuming she's available to him. But I think he takes that story and makes a decision about Jean's birthday based on it.
Also, before she tells this fable, he does admit that he admires her work. Did you take that at face value and thought that that was a genuine expression of Don Draper's opinion? Or is he saying that to woo her?
He's saying that to woo her. He knows that's an important thing with her. And I also wondered if that was maybe something he learned from Peggy, because Peggy says, you never say thank you, right? Like she wanted some credit. She wanted some acknowledgement and validation. And here's Dawn bringing that validation to Faye. And she expressed a need for it when she walked into his office in the Christmas party. So on the one hand, I'm like, okay, good job, Dawn, you listened. But at the same time, I don't think it's genuine. I think he's saying it because he knows she wants to hear it.
I think that's certainly possible, but it's the second thing he says after he says he admires her work that makes me think there is some sincerity there, because he asks her, how does she get them to do what she wants them to do? And that's her lead in to the fable. It seems to me he's conceding the effectiveness of her work, and he's interested into what is the key to unlock that effectiveness.
I would love it to be true that he isn't using her. As we move on in the scene in the cab, when Dawn kisses Faye, but he doesn't go to her apartment, I think she likes him better for it. And I think he seems a lot more into her than Bethany, although the cab rides ended differently. So I don't think that the flattery he's expressing to her is expecting immediate gratification either.
I took Don at face value there of just he is in a weird place. He's trying to take things slow. As Faye points out, this is not what she expected. I felt the same way as a viewer.
And it feels like this relationship maybe does have a future. He's not drinking too much. He's not sleeping with a woman from work on the first date. Maybe he's on some kind of personal ascent.
And in his commentary, Matt Weiner says that, he's rejecting her for a great reason, that he respects her, so he doesn't want to go too fast. He doesn't want to act impulsively with her.
The next morning, Don wakes up alone and goes back to the pool. There's a competitive younger man in the next lane, and it becomes a spontaneous race between them. Don wins, just barely, but the younger man turns and goes again. And that's the thing about a reset. You can cut your drinking down for a day, and you can not sleep with somebody on the first date for a day, but then you have to turn around and do it again the next day and the next. And it feels great to win, but then you have to keep swimming.
Well, and let's also say, too, that Don does not have a coughing fit after he wins the impromptu race to finish the lap.
I think it's a great symbol that we see him making progress, but then we see how much farther he still has to go. Later that afternoon, Betty's hosting Jean's birthday party, and Don enters with a giant stuffed elephant. He's always the elephant in the room in that house. Henry looks bothered to see him, but Betty has her act together. She picks Jean up off the floor. She walks him over to Don, saying, "Say hi to Daddy." When they separated, Betty told Don, "You will always be their father." And I see this as she's holding up that commitment. She did invite him to the party. She's not pretending Henry is Jean's father. And then she walks right back to Henry with a smile. So she got the message.
I agree with you. It seems to me Henry is a lot more upset at Don's presence than Betty is. And Betty reassures him by telling him, "We have everything."
We see Don holding Jean in the air and smiling at him. And it's maybe more happiness than we've ever seen Don have with any of his kids. How weird it would be if Jean turns out to be the favorite. I think I see Betty looking at Don holding Jean and being sad because why couldn't this man with so much potential live up to his promise? Don opens the episode writing that he was so lazy and everything could have been different. And he's talking about finishing high school. But doesn't it apply to his approach to his marriage too?
Yeah, I think it does. And it's not hard to see how, with just a little bit of additional effort, things could have gone very differently in that marriage. But the door is closed at this point, right? Things have moved on. So again, it's looking in the rearview mirror, which has its purposes, I suppose, but it doesn't have a lot to tell us about what's to come in the future.
And as Betty is all smiles at Henry, and then she looks back at Don, and she's a little more serious, I don't think Betty regrets leaving Don for Henry. But we saw Peggy having moments where she thought about what might have been if she had kept the baby. And I think that's what Betty is doing here. I think she can picture the alternative life she would have had with a healthier, committed Don Draper and feel sad that that never happened. And at the same time, she knows Henry is a better choice. I don't think the combination of Betty and Don is salvageable, even if they rejected Faye and Henry and decided, oh, we're going to try and make this work again. I think they're both too self-centered to be their best selves together. This is an odd episode for me because it feels like there's a definite turn away from the old and towards something new. It feels like there are some positive signs of hope for Don and maybe for the country, but there's also this undercurrent of darkness and doubt. What Vietnam is going to look like, and how long can you keep making healthy decisions, and will society be able to address its systemic injustices? So there's a lot going on here. Next up is another great episode, The Beautiful Girls. Today our listener shout-out goes to Maria C. Thank you for following us on social media. If you like our podcast, please share us with other Mad Men fans. And thank you so much for listening.
That's it for this episode of All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo. Visit our website, madmenctoz.com, to vote for your favorite Sterling lines and to share your opinions on our double dip questions for each episode.
You can find us on Instagram and YouTube at MadmenC2Z, and please listen, like, and subscribe. That's what the podcast's for.
Thanks for listening, everybody.